He heard it just as the flight attendant leaned in with a smile. "Why do they keep skipping us?" the passenger whispered behind him. But what shocked him more wasn't the question, it was the cold answer that followed. "Because you're not our priority." Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Raymond Ellis settled into seat 2A with the kind of ease only years of flying could teach. The hum of the engines, the faint scent of cabin air mixed with brewed coffee, even the stiff napkins folded just so, all familiar. Still, this flight was different. He wasn't flying as the CEO of Northway Air today. No security detail, no press in tow, no greetings from the captain over the intercom. Just Raymond Ellis, 60-ish, in a soft navy sweater, khakis, and a baseball cap low over his eyes. Ticket booked under the name Robert Henley, middle name of his father. No one would think twice. He had done this before, but not in a long time. Lately, reports had been surfacing, some subtle, some more direct, about inconsistencies in service, patterns that couldn't be ignored, complaints from passengers of color, staff allegations buried under procedural jargon. Nothing loud, nothing scandalous, just enough to raise a quiet concern in the back of his mind. So, here he was, anonymous among the morning flyers. First class, eastbound, seat 2A. The plane hadn't even leveled off when he began to take mental notes. Across the aisle sat two black men, maybe late 30s, dressed in business attire. They spoke softly, politely, not drawing attention, yet the flight attendant passed them twice without making eye contact. She asked the woman in 2C if she'd like another drink. Laughed with the couple in row 1, but barely acknowledged the men next to Raymond. At first, he thought maybe she was busy. Maybe something had happened in the galley. But as the flight stretched on, it became harder to excuse. The men asked for water once. It arrived 10 minutes later. Lukewarm, no ice. When one reached for a magazine tucked into the seat pocket, the attendant came by and removed it, saying they were preparing for landing, though they were still an hour out. Raymond watched, notebook discreetly balanced on his knee. He jotted down simple observations. Row 1 addressed by name. 2B, water late. 2D, asked twice for snack. Ignored. The more he saw, the more the knot in his stomach tightened. He'd built Northway on a promise, comfort and care for all passengers. He'd said it himself a dozen times at shareholder meetings. But what did that mean if dignity didn't come standard? From the corner of his eye, he noticed one of the men lean toward the aisle. His voice was soft but clear. "Did we do something wrong?" he asked the flight attendant. She didn't look at him. Her lips tightened as she placed a tray in front of the white man behind Raymond. "I'm attending to other guests," she said without pause. Raymond didn't move, but his eyes shifted. He looked directly at the man, then at the attendant, and back to the notebook in his lap. His pen hovered for a second. Then, slowly, he wrote a single word. Unacceptable. The rest of the flight was quiet. But Raymond's thoughts weren't. Raymond stepped off the plane without a word. The sun had already dipped behind the terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floor of the arrival hall. Passengers streamed past him, lost in their own travels, their suitcases trailing behind like tired pets. He walked slowly, head slightly down, the notebook still tucked under one arm. No chauffeur waited for him this time. No assistant hurrying with an iPad and updates. Just him and a growing knot in his chest. That night, back in his modest downtown apartment, he sat at his desk with the glow of the screen washing over his face. The familiar login page of Northway's internal system blinked gently. Waiting, he entered his credentials. As CEO, he still held full backend access, at least for now. His fingers moved methodically, pulling the flight manifest from that morning, Flight 722. The crew list came up. Names he vaguely recognized, faces he had likely shaken hands with at holiday parties and training briefings. Then came the passenger feedback report. He clicked it open. No complaints. The line stared back at him. Sterile and absolute. Service rated above standard. No negative entries logged. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. That couldn't be right. Not after what he saw with his own eyes. He refreshed the page. Same result. Something wasn't adding up. He reached for his phone and tapped Mara Lynn's contact. As head of customer experience, she'd always been sharp, responsive. She picked up on the second ring. Mara, he said calmly, I need the in-flight footage from this morning's 722 run. Passenger cabin, business class. There was a pause, just a few seconds longer than usual. Oh, Ray, she said lightly, I wish I could help. But the cabin camera's under maintenance. Has been for a couple of days now. We flagged it last week. Raymond didn't say anything right away. That camera was working when I boarded. He said, I saw the indicator light myself. Another pause. Then her tone shifted, less friendly, more procedural. I can double check with operations. But I'm pretty sure it was flagged. Do you want me to loop in internal comms for documentation? He ended the call with a tight thank you. Lips pressed in a thin line. A few minutes later, as he scrolled back through the report log, a new email arrived. No subject, no name. From an address inside the Northway network. All it said was, Flight 722, check the service log. They deleted the feedback. That was it. One sentence. But it sent a pulse through him. He navigated to the secondary service tracking database, a place few outside engineering even remembered. Hidden 2 layers deep, meant mostly for redundancy. And there it was. Entry timestamp 11:43 a.m. Passenger 3C. Complaint submitted. Unequal treatment. Flight attendant refused eye contact. Delayed water. Skipped basic courtesy. Marked duplicate. Removed 15 minutes later. His pulse picked up. He reopened the call log and dialed Mara again. She picked up slower this time. The deleted entry from 3C. He said directly, skipping pleasantries. Why was it removed? Raymond, she sighed. These systems aren't perfect. Sometimes complaints get flagged automatically. That's why we have filters. Maybe we should revisit this after the weekly ops meeting, loop in corporate affairs. It's best not to jump to conclusions. He heard the controlled tone behind her words. Polished, measured, but something in it rang too careful. I'll review it myself, he said quietly, then hung up. A few moments later, he tried refreshing his admin panel. The screen froze. A warning message popped up. Access restricted. Session terminated due to unusual activity. Please contact IT security. Raymond stared at it, his jaw tightening. It wasn't just the report anymore. Someone was actively blocking him. And that meant one thing. Someone inside Northway didn't want this seen. Raymond didn't sleep that night. Not really. His body stayed still, stretched across the couch, but his mind kept churning. The flicker of system errors. The tone in Mara's voice. The erased feedback. They all pointed in one direction. Something rotten was growing inside the company. And it wasn't just neglect. It was active, deliberate. By dawn, he was back at his desk, sipping black coffee gone cold too fast. The sun hadn't even warmed the window panes when he fired up an old laptop from his earlier years in operations. It ran slower than his current machine. But it had one advantage. It still carried a backup login from his days managing Northway's tech team. He used it now, not to check reports, but to dig into the buried corners of the feedback system, the ones that didn't pass through Mara's team. He entered through a maintenance portal meant for debugging archived customer surveys. Inside, he filtered for flights involving crew members from his recent trip. Over a dozen entries came up, all linked to various passengers of color. Reports that followed a pattern. Late service, dismissive tone, cold food trays, requests ignored. He clicked through them one by one. Each was flagged. Insufficient detail. Lacks supporting evidence. Likely duplicate. Then removed. He leaned forward. One report even listed the same flight number as his. Not 722. But another instance months earlier with the same crew on a different route. It described nearly identical behavior. The name on the complaint was redacted. But the words were too similar to ignore. He needed someone who had seen it firsthand. From the inside. And he knew just the person. Lena Portman had once been one of Northway's top-rated flight attendants. Young, sharp, good with people. She'd left suddenly. No announcement, no farewell message. Raymond had assumed she'd taken a job elsewhere. But now he wasn't so sure. He reached out through a secure channel and suggested coffee. offering only this. I need to ask you something that matters. They met at a quiet cafe tucked away on a side street. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and chipped mugs, where no one paid attention unless you wanted them to. Lena arrived on time, hair pulled back, eyes tired but alert. She offered a nod, not a smile. You said it mattered, she said, easing into the seat across from him. Raymond didn't waste her time. He told her about the flight, the way the two men were treated, the deleted report, the camera feed that had gone missing. Lena listened without interruption. Then she sighed and reached into her tote bag, pulling out a folder with creased edges. Inside was a printed email, dated 8 months earlier, addressed to her supervisor. It described a pattern of discriminatory behavior by a specific group of crew members. Nothing loud, nothing overt, but enough to make passengers uncomfortable. She had submitted it through the proper channels. The response she got? A reminder that unity within teams is more important than individual perceptions. Followed by a notice that she'd been removed from her next 3 assignments. That's when I knew, she said quietly. They didn't want it fixed. They wanted it buried. Raymond took the email, eyes scanning it carefully. No one ever followed up? He asked. She shook her head. Not once. They sat in silence, the clinking of spoons and murmured conversations fading into the background. Just as Raymond began to speak again, Lena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Then again, slower. Her face paled a little. Raymond leaned in. Something wrong? She handed the phone over. A text message from an unknown number. You're still meeting with people inside? Be careful. They didn't just take your job last time. Raymond felt a cold prickling in the back of his neck. His mind raced. This wasn't just resistance. Someone was watching, tracking. And if they knew Lena had met with him, he wasn't just a bystander anymore. He looked at her and said gently, "You don't have to get further involved." But Lena's eyes met his. "Steady. I already am." Raymond arrived at the Northway headquarters just after 6 in the morning. The sun was still yawning its way above the skyline, casting a weak orange across the marble floors of the quiet lobby. Security barely looked up as he tapped his badge, moving through the turnstile like a ghost slipping through a crowd. He took the side elevator to the lower tech wing, an area he hadn't stepped foot in for nearly 5 years. The corridors smelled faintly of coffee and circuit dust, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. The door to the support bullpen was already half open. Inside sat Jonas Tran, hunched over a terminal with the kind of posture that told you he'd been there long before sunrise. Jonas looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected the CEO to come down himself. "Mr. Ellis," he said cautiously, standing halfway. "Just Raymond," he replied, closing the door behind him. "We'll keep this between us." Jonas gave a hesitant nod and gestured toward the extra chair beside him. The room was small, just enough space for a desk, a server cabinet humming in the corner, and a stack of unopened keyboards still wrapped in plastic. Jonas looked older than Raymond remembered, though the man couldn't be more than 35. There were heavier lines under his eyes now, a guardedness in his voice that hadn't been there when they first met years ago. Raymond got straight to the point. "I need to know what's been happening with our feedback system. Specifically, I want to see what it looked like before the filters." Jonas blinked. "You mean the pre-processing records? Those are only stored for a week, unless they're archived by legal or comms." "I know," Raymond said, then paused. "But maybe there's still something left in the cache, especially if you know where to look." Jonas leaned back, lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse. Then he spoke quietly. "I got pulled into HR last year for accessing a service log I wasn't supposed to see. It was just routine debugging. But someone flagged it. Next thing I know, I'm moved here." "That why you stayed quiet?" Jonas shrugged. "You speak up once, you get marked." Raymond met his gaze. "I'm asking you to help me now. Not as a tech, as someone who's seen how easy it is to erase people's voices." A long breath escaped Jonas's chest. Then, slowly, he nodded. Together, they set up a plan. Jonas would pull records from the last 10 flights that included the same group of flight attendants. He'd compare the raw logs, those generated automatically in flight, with the final versions stored in the official customer experience portal. They needed to know how much was being scrubbed, and by whom. While Jonas got to work, Raymond returned upstairs to his office and drafted a message to the board. It was simple, careful, no direct accusations, no references to specific cases. He titled it, "On the Transparency of Passenger Feedback Systems." Just enough to test the waters. He clicked send. An hour and 42 minutes later, a new headline appeared in the company's internal bulletin. CEO Ellis launches quiet probe. Transparency or targeted purge? The article didn't quote anyone directly, but the tone was unmistakable. It described an atmosphere of anxiety in customer relations, hinted at morale concerns, and questioned whether leadership was taking the right path during a sensitive cultural moment. Raymond read the piece twice. Mara Lynn hadn't signed her name to it, but her fingerprints were all over the response that followed. In a separate memo issued to department heads, she wrote, "All internal reviews should be conducted with the proper oversight to prevent systemic disruption or unnecessary panic." He didn't need to read between the lines. The message was loud and clear. Someone was pushing back, and hard. Just as he was finishing a response draft, his inbox pinged again. No subject, no name, just a WAV file attached. Raymond clicked play. It was grainy, recorded from inside a meeting room. A man's voice, one he recognized from the board, spoke first. "If he keeps going, we'll take it to the executive panel. The press is already primed. No CEO survives that kind of narrative." Another voice chimed in, chuckling faintly. "Then let him step into the spotlight. He won't see the knife until it's already in." Raymond sat there, listening to the silence after the clip ended. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on your ribs. That made you feel like the room had gotten smaller. He looked out his office window. The city just beginning to buzz with morning traffic. They were preparing their version of the story. And if he didn't move faster, his would never be told. The main conference room on the 12th floor had never looked so polished. Bright banners hung from the ceiling, all stamped with corporate mantras like, "Service with heart," and "Elevating every journey." Rows of staff filled the seats, department heads, senior attendants, media from Northway's internal PR wing. Cameras were already rolling by the time Raymond stepped quietly into the back row. Unnoticed, he didn't plan on speaking. Today wasn't his show. At the front stood Mara Lynn, standing tall behind a podium draped in the company's colors. She looked perfectly composed, white blazer, hair pinned immaculately, that signature soft voice that always seemed to thread through every room without ever raising itself. She began with a warm smile. "Today," she said, "marks the beginning of our renewed promise to our customers. A new year, a sharper vision. Northway is proud to launch our Fair Flight initiative, ensuring every passenger, regardless of background, experiences the highest level of care." The room filled with polite applause. Raymond didn't clap. Mara continued with slides and curated testimonials, complete with bar graphs showing upward trends in customer satisfaction. But Raymond recognized the numbers. They were cherry-picked from post-flight surveys heavily filtered through algorithms designed to smooth out the noise. Noise, of course, meaning complaints. Then came the moment that made his stomach tighten. 4 flight attendants were invited up for recognition. One of them was the woman from Flight 722, the same one who had ignored 2 passengers for the better part of a cross-country flight. She smiled graciously as Mara presented her with a plaque. No mention of the erased feedback. No mention of anything. Really. Raymond sat motionless. His mind wasn't on the room. It was on Jonas, who was somewhere deep in the network server room, uploading raw, unfiltered logs into a secure repository only board members could access. It wasn't public, not yet, but it was something. A breadcrumb. After the applause died down, Raymond made his way toward the executive wing. He planned to speak privately with Chairman Patel, one of the few voices on the board who still held weight independent of the PR machine. But when he reached the assistant's desk, he was met with a tight-lipped smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ellis. Mr. Patel's calendar is booked solid for the next 10 days. 10? Raymond asked, barely hiding his disbelief. "Back-to-back meetings. He sends his regrets." Raymond stepped away without pushing further. But inside, something turned cold. As he returned to the main hallway, another familiar face caught his eye. Linda Chow. She stood near the press table, smiling faintly, arms folded, a well-known figure in the company for championing inclusive hiring and leading outreach efforts during turbulent times. For years, Linda had been one of his most trusted allies. When she stepped onto the stage and joined Mara, Raymond felt something twist in his chest. "I'm proud to support this initiative," Linda said into the mic. "Mara's team has worked hard to craft a campaign that not only speaks to our values but moves us forward. I look forward to helping shape its impact." The room applauded again, louder this time. Raymond didn't wait for the rest. He slipped out into the hallway, making his way toward the back staircase. Everything was tightening around him. The board was quiet. The press was aligned. Even his own circle had begun to shift. He was halfway to the elevator when a young man brushed past him, pretending to fumble a stack of files. As they collided slightly, the man pressed a small USB drive into Raymond's hand without making eye contact. "Keep it safe," the young man muttered under his breath. "They think I erased it." Raymond paused in the stairwell, heart quickening. He didn't plug the drive in immediately. Not here, not where the walls might be listening. Back home that night, with the blinds drawn and the volume on his laptop turned low, he opened the folder. There it was, raw security camera footage, Flight 722. The angle was wide but clear. Two men seated, quiet, a flight attendant passing them without a glance, ignoring them again and again. Later, laughing with a white couple in the same row. The difference in tone, the gestures, all of it was there. At the bottom of the screen, a timecode, and at the edge of the frame, just barely visible, Raymond himself, watching from across the aisle. He sat back in his chair, staring at the frozen image. Proof, the kind they couldn't twist with memos or internal op-eds. But proof came with a cost. The next morning, Raymond sat in his apartment with the USB drive balanced in his palm like it weighed far more than it did. The video was clear, undeniable, and damning, and it was his. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was figuring out what to do with it. He could walk it straight to the boardroom, slip it into a sealed envelope, send it through the private portal used for sensitive executive materials. But that would mean going through Mara's communication team, her filters, her gatekeepers. By the time it reached the right people, the footage might look different, or disappear altogether. Jonas, now back at his cramped tech station, had a different suggestion. "There's a journalist," he said, pulling up a screen. "Name's Carol Emmons. Used to work for the National Observer. She's been blacklisted from a few press pools because she doesn't play nice with corporate PR." Raymond squinted at the article Jonas pulled up. It was an exposé from 2 years back, about manipulated airline safety reports buried during merger negotiations. Her name rang a bell. "You think I should leak this?" Raymond asked, unsure if he was asking for confirmation or permission. Jonas gave a small shrug. "If you wanted to stay alive." Raymond leaned back. It wasn't that simple. He knew what happened when things went public. The narrative twisted, control was lost. And in a case like this, once it left the walls of Northway, there was no telling who would catch the blame. He wasn't trying to burn the company to the ground. He just wanted it to remember what it stood for. As he wrestled with that, his phone buzzed. "Lena, I found something," she said. She arrived that afternoon, her coat still dusted with rain. Her expression had changed, firmer, less guarded. She handed him a list scribbled in pen, along with a printed thread of old emails she'd recovered from a personal backup folder. "Before I got let go," she said, "I backed up everything on my office machine. I forgot most of it was there until last night." Raymond skimmed the messages. One in particular stood out, a chain from Mara's team regarding appropriate passenger profiling during peak travel hours. The language wasn't overt, but the implications were loud. Talk of targeting high-maintenance risk zones, trending profiles in complaint data, and passenger tone flags. "You don't have the machine anymore?" he asked. "It was company issued, had to turn it in. But the backup was tied to my old admin login." Jonas looked up. "That'd be stored on a mirrored drive in our old West Side server room." Raymond raised an eyebrow. That office had been shut down last quarter. All access cards voided. No cameras anymore. No security rotation. Just dust and time. That night, they drove in silence. Jonas had pulled schematics from the archive. He knew exactly where the equipment room was. They bypassed the front using an old maintenance entrance. Raymond held a flashlight steady while Jonas pried open the supply cabinet housing the backup servers. The room was cold. The hum of old machines still running out of habit filled the space. Jonas reached for a box labeled Lena_Portman 0721. A portable drive rested on top, but someone had beaten them to it. Next to the box was a note. Plain white paper. Typed, not written. I have what you're looking for. Come alone. Room 2703. Westfall Hotel. Tomorrow night. Raymond stared at it. No name. No threat. Just a location. As they locked up and stepped back into the lot, his phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered without speaking. A man's voice, smooth, deliberate. You're going too far, Raymond. This stopped being about a flight a long time ago. Raymond said nothing. The voice continued. You helped build this system. Don't pretend you didn't know what it was capable of. The line went dead. He stood there in the darkness. The phone still pressed to his ear. The city quiet around him. Whatever he had uncovered, it wasn't just about a plane ride anymore. Raymond stood in the elevator of the Westfall Hotel, staring at the glowing number as it ticked upward. 23, 24? The light buzzed faintly. By the time it reached 27, the hallway was silent. No sound but the distant hum of ventilation and the soft carpet padding beneath his shoes. Only one room had its light on. Near the end of the corridor. He knocked twice. The door opened just enough for a man to peek out. Then it swung wider. Terrence Miles looked older than Raymond remembered. Gray had spread across his beard, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed. But there was still something steady in his posture. He motioned for Raymond to enter, locking the door quietly behind him. I wasn't sure you'd come, Terrence said, voice low. I wasn't sure you'd still be here, Raymond replied. They sat across from each other in silence for a moment, the TV on mute casting a soft glow across the room. Terrence leaned forward and pulled out a small hard drive, wrapped in cloth. I held onto this longer than I should have, he said. 3 years ago, I tried to bring this forward. You know what happened? Raymond nodded. He remembered the internal memo. Terrence had been transitioned out after an unauthorized investigation. There was no mention of the actual allegations he'd made. I thought I could fix it from the inside, Terrence said, his gaze far away. But it doesn't work that way. They isolate you, then they erase you. He slid the drive toward Raymond. This has emails, voice memos, recordings of planning meetings. One of them, you'll hear Mara, and someone from the board, discussing how to manage public perception, scrub complaints, and shape what gets published. Raymond felt the weight of it in his hands, not just in gigabytes, but in consequence. Why now? He asked. Terrence looked him straight in the eye. Because you're finally doing what no one else dared. And if you go down, someone should still have this. Raymond exhaled slowly. I won't say your name. Terrence offered a tired smile. Good. I've got a quiet life now. Not a lot of it left. But I'd like to keep what remains. They stood. Raymond gave a slight nod and left the room. The door clicking shut behind him. Back in the hallway, something shifted. As he stepped out of the hotel lobby, a silver sedan tore around the corner and veered dangerously close. Tires screeched. Raymond stumbled back, nearly landing on the sidewalk. The car didn't stop. It sped away. No plates, no signal, no hesitation. That wasn't random. He stood there for a moment, hand on his knee, heart thudding in his chest. Back home, he called Jonas immediately. You all right? Jonas asked, already sounding wired. I almost got hit by a car outside the Westfall. Jonas paused. Then, that's not all. Our activity logs. Someone's duplicating our movement through the server. And not just you and me. Lena's access logs were pulled and copied. Raymond looked at the hard drive in his hand. Have you heard from her? No, she hasn't responded since yesterday. Raymond felt a knot form in his stomach. Then his phone buzzed. Lena. He picked up quickly. Her voice was sharp, panicked. They know about the video. I shouldn't have reached out again. I'm leaving town. The line cut off. Lena? Lena. Silence. 5 minutes later, another notification popped up. Breaking alert on a local traffic site. A woman. Mid-30s. Found unconscious after a single vehicle crash on I-84. No identification confirmed. Injuries reported. Status unknown. Raymond's hands trembled as he set the phone down. This was no longer a matter of policy. It had become a matter of survival. Raymond stood by the window of his study, watching the clouds roll across the city skyline, the lights below flickering like a silent warning. He had run out of time. The threats had sharpened. The board had turned. Lena had vanished into the silence of a hospital room. And the system they all built was now turning inward like a snake biting its own tail. There was only one move left. He called Diane Keller just after sunrise. Her voice on the other end was crisp. No nonsense. The kind of tone that could stop a senator mid-sentence. Raymond had known her by reputation. Her exposés had sunk pharmaceutical giants and derailed corrupt transit executives, but he had never met her in person. "You better not be wasting my time," she said before he even finished his pitch. "I have recordings, logs, witness statements, and a video clip you need to see." There was a pause. "Where are you?" she asked. An hour later, they sat across from each other in a small office Raymond rented under an alias. He plugged in the USB, pulled up the files, and let them speak for themselves. First the clip from the plane. Then the recordings of Mara and a board member planning how to manage the narrative. Diane leaned back in her chair, silent for a long moment. "Damn," she muttered finally. "All right, I'll run it, but we need to be surgical. I'll use a segment on Truthline this Sunday. People still watch that show. I'll frame it as a systemic issue. Keep it tied to behavior patterns. Not just one bad apple. I need your help making it real." Raymond said, "If this feels like a personal vendetta, they'll discredit it. I need this to be about the passengers. We'll need tech verification, metadata, timestamps, chain of custody, and at least one insider to go on record." Raymond already knew who to call. Jonas was hesitant, but not unwilling. "I'll review everything. Confirm the logs are untouched. But I'm not going on camera." "I'm not asking you to," Raymond said. "Just your name on a sealed affidavit. That's enough for Truthline's lawyers." Raymond reached out to two other employees in the data team, folks who'd stayed quiet but never looked comfortable in Mara's meetings. By the end of the day, he had what he needed: internal sign-offs, technical verification, and one anonymous tip from a staffer who wrote, "Thank you for not letting this slide." But Mara wasn't sitting idle. By Friday morning, an emergency meeting had been called. The board was gathering under the pretense of governance review. Rumors swirled through Northway's halls that Raymond had violated security protocols, that he was facing suspension, that legal was drafting language for a quiet exit. Raymond walked into the boardroom wearing a charcoal suit, carrying the same leather briefcase he'd used for 30 years. The air inside was thick. Mara sat at the head of the table, composed, dressed impeccably in a white blouse and navy blazer. Her eyes didn't flinch when he entered. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to make it clear that today's discussion is about organizational stability, not personal grievance." Raymond didn't bother to sit. He pulled a small tablet from his case and placed it on the table. "I'm not here to defend myself," he said. "I'm here to show you what I've seen, and what I've heard, and what some of you have tried to erase." He tapped the screen. The video played first. The footage from Seat 3C. The subtle but clear differences in treatment. The tone of the flight attendant's voice. The discomfort on the faces of two black passengers. Then came the audio clips. Mara's voice. The board member's voice. Words like optics, filter feedback, and align with branding. Finally, Raymond displayed the log files, the backend deletions, the timestamps, the repeated flagging of minority passengers' comments as irrelevant. Mara stood slowly. "This is a stunt," she said. "None of this has been authenticated. It's cherry-picked, manipulated, and let's not forget, Raymond accessed these files without authorization. That's a violation of protocol. Plain and simple." Someone on the board shifted uncomfortably. "You're exploiting old information to stir chaos," she continued. "And you're dragging our name through the mud for what? Legacy?" Before anyone could reply, the door opened. Linda Chow walked in, holding a file. She looked around, then straight at Mara. "I'm sorry for the interruption," Linda said, "but I have something the board should see." She handed the folder to the chair. Inside were printed memos, email chains, and internal routing notes, all signed or notated by Mara herself. At the bottom was a summary log, listing 43 deleted customer feedback forms. Reason for deletion? The chair asked aloud. Linda answered, doesn't match brand message. That was the justification. She looked at Mara. I believed in what we built. Until you decided truth was bad for business. Raymond didn't speak. He didn't have to. The room had changed. The boardroom was still as a library, save for the faint rustle of paper. One by one, the members of the board sifted through the documents Linda had placed in front of them. Eyes flicked from line to line, expressions tightening. The words were plain, clinical, language pulled from internal memos. But the implications were damning. Phrases like, filter feedback from target demographics, and realign perception with projected brand values, stood out in stark contrast against Northway's public claims of equity and inclusion. The emails were dated, signed, and authenticated. There was no walking this back. Mara Lynn remained seated, posture perfect, expression unreadable. When the last page was turned, she folded her hands and calmly reached for her phone. I'd like our legal counsel present, she said flatly, dialing with no hesitation. If we're opening an inquiry, it needs to include every member of this board who approved the Q3 communication strategy. I did not act alone. Someone on the board cleared their throat, but said nothing. Raymond didn't sit. He watched her for a moment, then stepped forward and placed his hand on the table. You can bring in every attorney on payroll, he said, but this isn't about strategy or spin. It's about people, about the ones we forgot the moment their names didn't fit into our PowerPoint slides. His voice was quiet but carried through the room like a crack of thunder. This company used to stand for something, he continued, and somewhere along the way, we traded integrity for market share. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here because someone asked a flight attendant, did we do something wrong? And instead of answering, we looked away. No one spoke. After a pause, the chair suggested a closed session. The board would deliberate in private, then reconvene. Raymond nodded and left the room without another word. Outside the conference suite, Diane Keller was waiting in a hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Her notepad was already open. We're locked and loaded, she said. Truthline goes live at 8. We're releasing the data to national outlets with our independent analysis. 2 major papers have verified the evidence and signed on to co-publish. It's out of their hands now. Raymond exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized how much he was holding in until that moment. Thank you, he said, but the sense of relief didn't last long. His phone buzzed with a message from Jonas. Urgent. Raymond stepped into a side room and called back immediately. We've got a problem, Jonas said, the guy who helped us pull the original backup. I just found out he's been forwarding mirror logs to someone else this whole time. Raymond's stomach sank. Who? Andrew Cormack, Jonas replied. He worked in brand integrity. He's not even on our active clearance list anymore. But he used an old admin passcode. I should have caught it sooner. Raymond hung up without saying another word. The rest of the day moved in slow motion. The board's private meeting dragged into the late afternoon. No official statement came out. Rumors swirled across departments, from top-floor executives down to ground crews. A few employees whispered about resignations. Others pretended nothing had changed. When Raymond finally returned to his office that evening, it was quiet, too quiet. The lights were already on, which was strange. He didn't remember leaving them that way. There was a single envelope on his desk. No label, no name. Inside was a folded sheet of heavyweight paper, written in ink that looked freshly dried. It read, I stood with you once, Raymond. I believed in your leadership. But we both knew the line we agreed never to cross, protecting the image of this company at all costs. That promise mattered to me. Still does. Then, on the next line, you broke it. I didn't. Signed, Andrew Cormack. Raymond stared at the signature for a long time. Andrew, the same man who had quietly sat in every rebranding meeting, who never raised his voice, never took credit, who Raymond had once thought of as a silent ally in times of crisis. He had barely said a word since retiring last year, but apparently, he had never really left. Raymond turned the envelope over and noticed something faintly etched into the inside flap. A string of numbers. It took a moment to recognize it, a system node address. One used to mirror server activity in offsite backups. There were layers. Mara hadn't been acting alone. She was a tool, well-dressed, composed, obedient to a vision. But the vision? That came from deeper inside. From Andrew. From those like him who thought silence was strategy and control was virtue. Raymond sat down slowly, the weight of it all pressing on his shoulders. He had peeled back one mask, only to find another face beneath it. The hour struck 8 and television screens across the country flickered to the familiar opening of Truthline. Diane Keller's steady voice introduced the segment with calm precision. But it was the content that drew silence. The video rolled, grainy yet unmistakable. A flight attendant ignoring 2 black passengers, barely concealing her disdain. The overhead recording caught the tension in the air. It didn't need narration. Then came the emails, projected for millions to read. Messages dismissed, erased, flagged as duplicates or brand risk content. The voice recordings followed. Mara Lynn's voice, confident and cold, speaking about shaping narrative and silencing deviation. Then, Lena's voice, recorded only days earlier from a secure location, came through the speakers. She recounted what she'd witnessed, what she'd tried to report, and how the system responded. Viewers across the country leaned in closer. The weight of her words wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The backlash came quickly and from every direction. Social media platforms overflowed with outrage, testimonials, and support for the whistleblowers. Northway wasn't alone. People began naming other airlines, recounting similar experiences. Civil rights organizations called for a nationwide review of service practices in the aviation industry. Government regulators stepped in to request formal statements. Inside Northway's glass towers, the impact was immediate. Mara Lynn was suspended within 12 hours. An internal review was ordered, led by an external compliance firm. Quietly, 3 board members stepped down, avoiding further scrutiny but not escaping public notice. Anonymous statements cited a need for reflection and personal accountability. A press conference was scheduled. Raymond stood at the podium. No suit, no script. The room was packed. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. "I've been asked if I'll return as CEO," he said, "and my answer is no." Murmurs spread across the room. "I don't need a title to do what's right," Raymond continued. "I only need to know that the voices we ignored have finally been heard." This wasn't about saving a company's image, it was about saving its soul. He stepped back without taking questions. In the days that followed, a new chapter began. Linda Chow was appointed Director of Internal Culture Transformation. Her first move was to implement a direct access policy for frontline employees to report concerns, without departmental filters. Jonas, whose role had once been hidden behind lines of code and locked directories, moved into the Audit and Transparency Division. His systems would now monitor the monitors. Lena, recently relocated and under protection, joined as an advisor in Northway's Service Equity Council. Her first task: draft a service training program centered around empathy and accountability. Raymond didn't attend their first meeting. Instead, he was at home, if you could call the quiet one-bedroom off Beacon Street home. He made tea, sat by the window, and watched the city blur into dusk. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a breath that felt complete. His phone vibrated against the side table. The screen lit up. No name, no subject line, just a message in bold. Subject: "They haven't stopped. You need to see this. Flight Safety Report 14B." He stared at the screen for a long moment. The heat in his tea had faded, but his pulse hadn't. He opened the message. No body text, just an attachment. And he knew the story wasn't over, not even close. Because truth doesn't rest. And when you peel away one layer of silence, you often find another underneath it, thicker, darker, and harder to face. Raymond leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the horizon. He didn't flinch. He simply whispered to himself, "Then we keep going." And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Sometimes the people with the power to change everything are the ones who choose to listen, not to lead. Raymond didn't fight for a title. He fought for people who never got heard. What about you? Have you ever witnessed something that felt wrong, but no one said a word? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your story too. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow Undercover Truths for more real stories that uncover what others try to hide.